right, so we are diving into something I think pretty relevant as we're recording this.
Definitely timely.
It's President Trump's recent executive orders on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI,
Right.
and how that all intersects with Black History Month. We've got 3 sources here, articles from both NBC and Axios, plus a quick news bulletin from ABC. And I think we can pretty much bet that there are some strong opinions out there about this.
Yeah, for sure. I think what's really striking is how this is all kind of unfolding, as
Yeah.
we head into Black History Month. It's almost like you've got these two major forces that are on a collision course on one hand, this pretty significant policy shift, and then on the other, Black History Month, this deeply symbolic cultural event.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really makes you wonder what the ripple effects will be, especially because the reactions have been so varied. Some people are really, applauding this. They see it as pushing back against what they call, wokeness.
Mm.
Basically, we view DEI programs as having gone too far, too focused on social justice.
Mhm.
But then you have others who see this as a huge step backward, like an attempt to just kind of erase parts of history that make certain people uncomfortable.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It really gets at the heart of how we view history and whose perspectives get prioritized, whose get kind of pushed to the side. But to really get a handle on the impact, I think we need to sort of unpack what these DEI programs actually involve, what they look like in practice.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down a little bit. So these programs, especially within the federal government, often mean things like, specialized training for employees,
Mhm.
uh, efforts to recruit a more diverse workforce, from a wider range of backgrounds,
Mhm.
and then just creating resources that promote inclusion in the workplace.
Right.
And so Trump's executive order basically argues that these programs are incompatible with the values of the Department of Defense. Specifically, they cite things like promoting division and guilt.
Yeah, and the result of all this has been like a whirlwind of activity across all these federal agencies. I mean, we're seeing them just frantically trying to comply with this order,
Yeah.
scrubbing DEI content from their websites, putting staff who work on DEI initiatives on leave, even pausing existing initiatives.
It's almost like someone just slammed on the brakes and everybody's trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now?
Yeah, exactly.
And then right in the middle of all of this, Trump issues a proclamation recognizing Black History Month. The tradition that's been going on since 1976 started with President Ford. It's a pretty jarring juxtaposition when you think about it.
It really is, right? Like,
Yeah.
on the one hand, you've got this pretty aggressive crackdown on DEI initiatives across the government. And then on the other hand, you have the White House, at least according to Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, saying that they still plan to celebrate Black History Month, emphasizing American history as a whole.
Right.
It's almost like they're trying to reconcile these two totally opposite ideas.
Yeah, and this is where things get really complicated, especially when you look at what happened with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA.
Yeah.
So according to NBC, their initial reaction to the executive order was to just put a pause on all activities related to special observances. And that included Black History Month.
Wow. But then, just to add another layer of complexity to this whole thing, the DIA clarified that, while events are on hold, MLK Day and Juneteenth are still recognized as federal holidays. I mean, can you imagine being the person who has to sort all of this out?
Talk about mixed messages. It seems like everybody's just trying to kind of decipher what these orders mean in real time.
Yeah, totally.
And the DIA spokesman, Lieutenant Commander Seth Clark, he was actually quoted in the ABC Bulletin saying that, they're working to implement all executive orders in a timely manner. But what does that even look like?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. And it leads to this much bigger debate about what DEI is really about and why it's become such a flashpoint.
Yeah. I think that's what makes this deep dive so important. Because it's not just about politics. It's about how we as a society understand our own history.
Yeah.
And the Axios article does a good job of kind of laying out the conservative argument, which is that these DEI initiatives often promote guilt or push a very specific agenda.
And this ties back to that whole idea of wokeness that we were talking about earlier. For a lot of people, it's become this shorthand for what they perceive as, an excessive focus on social justice issues, often at the expense of other values. But of course, people who are critical of Trump's actions see it very differently. They view this as a deliberate attempt to stifle uncomfortable conversations about race and inequality.
Yeah, and the example that they use in the Axios article is really striking. It's the Tuskegee Airmen, these incredibly brave African-American pilots who served during World War II.
Right.
Their story was almost removed from the Air Force curriculum as part of this,
Mhm.
anti-DEI push. And it really makes you wonder, if we're not careful, what other parts of history might be pushed aside or even erased completely?
It's a slippery slope, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And I think this example really highlights a larger point, which is that the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is American history. It's not just a DEI talking point. As Edmund W. Davis, who's a scholar who studied the Tuskegee Airmen extensively, points out, their contributions go beyond just race.
Right.
Their story includes women, Latinos, all these different individuals who showed incredible courage and resilience.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole situation even more thought-provoking, right? Because
Yeah.
Black history isn't some separate category. It's interwoven with the American story as a whole.
Mm.
It's a story of persistence, of fighting for recognition, and of making just incredible contributions in the face of really, overwhelming adversity.
Absolutely. And that's where historian Martha S. Jones makes this really powerful statement in the Axios article. She reminds us that Black History Month wasn't something that was just, handed out by the government. It was the culmination of decades of activism,
Uh-huh.
especially during the Jim Crow era. And, figures like Carter G. Woodson, they spearheaded this movement. They understood the power of preserving history, of making sure these stories were told.
It really makes you think about the weight of that legacy and how history is never truly erased, even when people try to suppress it. It lives on in the stories we tell, the books we read, the conversations we have.
Yeah, it's this constant evolution, this back and forth. You've got people who want to control the narrative, and then you've got others who are determined to make sure that, a wider range of voices and perspectives are heard.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Trump's executive order, the kind of scramble across federal agencies to implement it, the historical context of Black History Month, and then this larger fight over preserving and accurately representing history. It's a lot to process.
It really is. But I think the key takeaway here is that, this fight over history, it's far from over. It's an ongoing process. And it's really up to each of us to stay informed, to engage in these thoughtful conversations, and to recognize that, individual action really does matter in shaping the narrative.
So as we move into the next part of this deep dive, I want you to think about this. If Black History Month wasn't, some kind of gift, but this hard-won achievement, what does that tell us about the importance of speaking truth to power, of preserving history, and of just continuing to fight for, a more just and inclusive future?
It's a powerful question to consider, and we'll unpack the nuances of this, complex and evolving situation as we continue our exploration in part 2. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive. It's really interesting to me how this whole situation with the executive order and Black History Month, it really highlights the power of symbols. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, on one hand, you have this very direct, executive order that targets these DEI programs, and then just days later, you have this proclamation acknowledging Black History Month. It feels almost calculated,
Yeah.
like an attempt to control the narrative around diversity and inclusion.
Doesn't it? It's like they're trying to say, look, we're not trying to erase Black history.
Mm.
You know, we're just trying to make things more efficient. But the timing is just so symbolic. There's this real tension there. It just feels like something doesn't quite add up.
Right. And it makes you question, what are the intentions behind all of this? And I think that dissonance that you're talking about is really playing out in how these different federal agencies are reacting. Like, remember that DIA memo we talked about?
Yeah.
The one that initially halted all those special observance activities, including the ones for Black History Month.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the confusion that this executive order has caused. It's almost like the DIA got caught in the crosshairs. Like they were trying to implement these really broad directives while also, trying to recognize the importance of these cultural events like Black History Month.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole,
Mm.
right? Like, how do you even begin to celebrate Black History Month without addressing the very issues of diversity and inclusion that are at the heart of it?
Right. It's this really tricky situation. It raises all these really fundamental questions about, like, what does it even mean to pause Black History Month? Can you really separate the celebration from these core issues of diversity and inclusion that are just so inextricably linked to it?
It's like trying to bake a cake and then saying, okay, now let's take out all the sugar and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. It just doesn't work that
Like,
way.
you change the fundamental nature of the thing.
Yeah, and that's what I think makes this whole situation so compelling. It's forcing us to really think critically about what history means, how we engage with it, and who ultimately gets to shape the narrative.
And all of this is happening against this backdrop of, really intense political polarization, which I think makes having, a nuanced and productive conversation about these issues even harder.
Oh, absolutely. Everything just gets filtered through this lens of us versus them. It makes it really hard to find common ground or even, agree on basic facts.
And it brings us back to something that Martha Jones emphasized in that Axios article, which was that, Black History Month wasn't something that was granted by the government. It was the result of decades of tireless activism, particularly during, a period of immense racial injustice in America.
Right. And that highlights this really crucial point. History isn't something that is just handed down, you know, from on high. It's something that's actively shaped, fought for, constantly reevaluated. It's this living, breathing narrative that changes as we learn more and as our understanding of the past kind of shifts.
Yeah. So I think as we grapple with, the implications of this executive order and its impact on Black History Month, I think it's so important to approach this issue with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to really listen to different perspectives, and just an understanding that we're all part of this ongoing conversation about what history means and how we choose to remember it.
I couldn't agree more. And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's not just about facts and dates. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, and what kind of future we want to build.
Yeah. It's about acknowledging the complexities and the struggles and the triumphs that have shaped, our present reality. And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in making sure that those stories are told accurately and fairly and with respect for all of the diverse experiences that make up, the American narrative.
And with that very thought-provoking note, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. We'll be back for the final part and to further unpack the complexities of this evolving situation and explore some key takeaways for you to consider.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. It's really remarkable to me how this conversation about, an executive order has kind of spiraled out to touch on history, politics, even the meaning of celebration itself.
It really speaks to how interconnected all these issues are. What might seem like an isolated policy decision actually has these much broader implications that kind of ripple outwards. Makes you realize that we can't really view these things in isolation.
No, absolutely not. It's
Uh,
like whether it's, DEI programs, Black History Month, even the ongoing fight for social justice, it's all part of this larger tapestry. And understanding that tapestry requires us to go deeper, to really look at the historical context and recognize the individual stories that have shaped, our present reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of individual stories, I'm reminded of the point that Edmund Davis made about the Tuskegee Airmen. You know how he argued that their story is plain old history, not just some talking point in the whole DEI debate. And I think that's such a powerful reminder that, sometimes the best way to combat, attempts to erase history or distort it is simply to tell the truth, to share those stories with all of their complexity and nuance.
Yeah, it makes you think about the legacy of people like Carter G. Woodson, who, founded Negro History Week, which eventually became Black History Month. Like, he understood the power of, making sure that those stories, these crucial pieces of history, were passed down to future generations.
He was a real visionary. He understood that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the lives and experiences of real people. And those stories have the power to inspire, to challenge, to really change the way that we see the world.
Yeah, and that's why it's so critical to resist any attempt to silence those voices or, limit access to those diverse perspectives. If we really want to understand, our history, who we are as a nation, we need to embrace the full spectrum of experiences,
Yeah.
even the ones that make us uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Our understanding of history should always be evolving,
Yeah.
and it's those new voices, those fresh perspectives that really enrich and deepen our understanding.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. Martha Jones, how she reminded us that Black History Month wasn't this, gift bestowed by the government. It was a hard-fought victory, a real testament to the power of, persistence and activism.
And that raises a really crucial question for all of us to consider. If Black History Month wasn't something that was just, handed down from on high, if it emerged from the grassroots, what does that tell us about the importance of individual action?
What does it tell us about the power of speaking truth to power, of preserving history, in the face of adversity, and of just continuing to fight for a more just and inclusive future? They aren't easy questions, but they're so essential for us to grapple with.
Absolutely. History isn't just something we read about in textbooks, you know. It's something that we're actively creating each and every day through our choices, our actions, the stories that we choose to tell.
And that's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping that narrative, in amplifying those diverse voices, and in honoring the legacies of those who came before us.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with, the complexities of history.
Because it's through those difficult conversations, those moments of reflection, those courageous acts, that we can build a more informed, more empathetic, and ultimately a more just world.
And that concludes our deep dive into DEI, Black History Month, and the power of history. We hope this exploration has been insightful and thought-provoking for you. Until next time, keep those minds open and those conversations flowing.